It was 1968 when my wife and I decided to move to the French countryside. We had been searching for a fresh start, somewhere far from the noise and chaos of the city. And when we stumbled across the listing for a charming, old stone house nestled in a quiet village, it felt like fate. The price was almost suspiciously low, but we were too enamored with the idea of owning our dream home to question it. From the moment we arrived, the house seemed peculiar. It was an imposing structure, its aged stone facade covered in creeping ivy, with windows that seemed to watch us as we approached. The villagers we met while unloading our belongings were polite but distant. I could feel their stares lingering a little too long, as if they wanted to say something but chose not to. One older man, his face lined with years of hard labor, finally approached us. He hesitated before speaking, his voice low. "You bought La Maison Sanglante, didn't you?" I didn't understand the term at first. Bloody house? Surely. It was just local superstition. My wife laughed it off, and I forced a polite smile, assuring him we weren't afraid of ghost stories. But his warning lingered in my mind. Not all scars heal. Some houses keep them. Inside, the house was exactly as the listing described. Quaint, rustic, and in need of some love. The wooden floors creaked underfoot. The wallpaper was faded and peeling in places, but it had character. Still, there was an odd heaviness in the air, like the house had been holding its breath for decades. That first night, as we unpacked, I noticed how silent it was. Too silent. No chirping crickets, no rustling trees. Just an oppressive stillness that settled over the house like a thick blanket. My wife was too excited about decorating to notice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the place was off. When we went to bed, I found myself lying awake listening. For what, I wasn't sure, but there was a tension in the house that made my skin crawl. It felt as if the walls were pressing in, listening to my every breath. I told myself it was just nerves. Moving to a new place, especially one so isolated, takes time to adjust. Yet, in the back of my mind, the old man's words echoed. What scars could this house possibly hold? It began subtly. At first, I almost convinced myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me. The second night in the house, as we were unpacking boxes in the kitchen, I heard a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. My wife hadn't noticed, and hummed to herself as she sorted through our dishes. I decided not to mention it. The next morning, we woke up to a strange sight. In the corner of the living room, near the old fireplace, a single chair had been moved. I was certain we hadn't placed it there. It was facing the center of the room, as though someone had sat there, silently watching us during the night. My wife shrugged it off as forgetfulness, or maybe one of us bumping it while carrying boxes. But deep down, I knew neither of us had moved it. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the windows, but seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Tap, tap, tap. My wife heard it too, and asked me if it could be rats. I nodded, pretending to agree, though I knew it sounded too deliberate for an animal. By the third night, things escalated. I was jolted awake by a sound, something like a low groan that reverberated through the house. My wife stirred beside me, groggy and irritated. "It's probably just the pipes," she murmured before drifting back to sleep. But it didn't feel like pipes. The sound carried a weight, an almost human agony that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I combed through the house, checking every corner for anything that could explain the noises. As I reached the cellar door, I felt an inexplicable chill. The handle was ice cold to the touch, and when I opened it, a faint, metallic smell wafted up from the darkness. The cellar was damp and cluttered, filled with decades of dust-covered junk left behind by previous owners. But what caught my attention was the far wall. The stone there seemed darker, stained as if something had seeped into it over time. As I leaned in to get a closer look, I felt a sharp drop in temperature. My breath fogged in the air, and I swear I heard something. Faint whispers, barely audible, like words carried on the wind. I backed out of the cellar quickly, heart pounding. When I told my wife what I'd found, she laughed nervously, and told me I was being dramatic. "It's an old house," she said. "Old houses have their quirks," but I could see the unease flickering in her eyes. That night, I woke again, this time to the sound of something falling. I rushed to the living room and found one of the heavy picture frames we'd hung earlier shattered on the floor. The nail it had hung on was bent upward, as though something had forcefully yanked the frame off the wall. And then I saw it, the faint outline of a handprint smeared in the dust on the glass. It was too large to be mine or my wife's, and the fingers were unnaturally long. By the time the following night arrived, the tension in the house was almost suffocating. My wife and I tried to act normal, but neither of us could deny that something was very wrong. We kept the lights on in every room, hoping it would make us feel safer, but the shadows seemed deeper somehow, more menacing, as though they were waiting for the right moment to move. Around midnight, the noises began again. This time, it was louder than before, an almost rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from deep within the walls. My wife clutched my arm, her face pale. "That's not rats," she whispered. We followed the noise, cautiously moving from room to room. When we reached the kitchen, the pounding stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. And then, as if on cue, every cabinet door flung open at once with a deafening crash. My wife screamed, and I froze, my mind racing to find some rational explanation. A draft? Vibrations? But none of it made sense. The doors hadn't just creaked open. They had slammed outward with a force that was impossible to ignore. The atmosphere in the house seemed to shift after that moment. The air felt heavier, oppressive, as though the house itself was watching us. That night, neither of us could sleep. We lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the floorboards sending a jolt of fear through us. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the low groan, this time closer, as though it was just outside our bedroom door. I held my breath, listening intently. Then came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy and uneven, moving down the hallway toward the living room. I mustered the courage to get up, grabbing a flashlight from the nightstand. My wife begged me not to go, her voice trembling, but I couldn't just stay there, paralyzed by fear. I opened the door cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, leading me to the staircase. As I descended, the air grew colder with each step. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. The cellar door was open. It had been locked earlier that evening. I was sure of it. The metallic smell hit me again, stronger this time, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I approached the cellar door, the flashlight trembling in my hand. When I peered inside, my blood ran cold. The dark stain on the far wall had grown, now stretching across almost the entire surface, and in the faint light, I could see something else, scratches, deep grooves carved into the stone, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like letters. I didn't stay to decipher them. Slamming the door shut, I locked it again and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. When I returned to the bedroom, my wife was sitting up, wide-eyed. "I saw him," she whispered. Her words sent a chill through me. "Saw who?" She pointed to the corner of the room, her hand trembling. There was a man just standing there. He was watching us. I turned my flashlight to the corner she indicated, but it was empty. Still, the lingering sense of being watched was undeniable. The following day, we decided to leave. It wasn't a discussion. It was a silent understanding between my wife and me. Whatever was in that house didn't want us there, and we weren't about to test its patience any further. But as we began packing our belongings, the house seemed to retaliate. It started with the lights. Every bulb in the house flickered erratically, plunging us into alternating darkness and blinding brightness. Then came the noises, more violent than before. Not just the rhythmic pounding, but crashes, shattering glass, and what sounded like guttural growls reverberating through the walls. In a panic, I told my wife to wait outside while I gathered the last of our things. She was reluctant to leave me, but the fear in her eyes told me she was ready to get as far away from the house as possible. She stood near the car, nervously glancing back at the house as I ran upstairs to grab our bags. As I entered the bedroom, the air shifted again. It felt thick, suffocating, and I struggled to breathe. Then I heard it, whispering. Faint at first, but growing louder, as if multiple voices were speaking over each other in a language I couldn't understand. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I grabbed the bags and turned to leave, but the bedroom door slammed shut in front of me. The whispers turned to screams, angry, guttural screams that made my head feel like it was about to split open. I pounded on the door, yelling for my wife, but my voice was drowned out by the deafening cacophony. Then suddenly silence. I turned around and my heart stopped. The figure was there, standing in the corner of the room. He was tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to fill the space. His face was obscured in shadow, but I could feel his gaze on me, cold, unrelenting, and full of malice. For a moment, I couldn't move, paralyzed by a terror I'd never felt before. Then, as if by some primal instinct, I bolted for the window. I didn't care about the height. I just needed to get out. But as I approached, the window slammed shut, the glass rattling in its frame as though the house itself was trying to trap me. Desperation took over, and I began screaming for help. I could hear my wife outside, yelling my name, but her voice sounded distant, as if we were worlds apart. I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and swung it at the window with all my strength. The glass shattered, and I didn't hesitate. I climbed through the jagged opening, cutting my arms and legs in the process, and fell to the ground below. When I landed, my wife ran to me, tears streaming down her face. "We need to go. Now," I gasped, grabbing her hand. We jumped into the car and sped away, not daring to look back. As we drove, the oppressive feeling began to lift, but the house didn't let us leave unscathed. In the rearview mirror, I caught one final glimpse of it, the tall figure, standing in the front window, watching us leave. Even after we left the house behind, its presence lingered. Nightmares plagued our sleep, and the faint sound of whispers would echo in the quiet moments of the day. I knew we couldn't just let it go, not without understanding what we had encountered. I began researching the house obsessively, piecing together fragments of its dark history. Old records from the town archives told a story that made my blood run cold. The house was built during the Second World War, requisitioned by the Nazi regime as a safe house for high-ranking officers stationed in France. As the war turned against them, the officers reportedly began torturing prisoners in the basement, conducting horrific experiments. The locals called it La Maison Sanglante after the war, the Bleeding House, a name whispered with both fear and reverence. But that wasn't all. Decades later, when the house was sold to a French family in the 1960s, the nightmares began again. That family also reported blood seeping through the walls, strange voices, and violent apparitions. They had fled after a priest declared the house a gateway to hell. I couldn't ignore the coincidence, or the horrors we had experienced firsthand. The more I dug, the darker the stories became. Some spoke of shadowy figures seen in the windows late at night. Others mentioned violent injuries to anyone who dared stay in the house too long. And then there were the whispers about what was buried beneath the house. That was the final piece of the puzzle. It turned out the house had been built over a mass grave, 50 soldiers from the war, hastily buried to cover up atrocities. The priest's declaration about the house being a gateway suddenly made sense. Whatever evil had tainted the ground beneath it had seeped into its walls, manifesting in ways I couldn't explain or comprehend. I decided to contact a local historian who specialized in the occult. When I met with her, she was visibly disturbed by the house's name. "No one speaks of that place anymore," she said. "It's cursed ground. Demonic energy thrives there because of the violence committed within its walls and the restless spirits trapped beneath it. Destroying the house might release whatever is bound there, or it might unleash something far worse." Her words haunted me. Destroying the house seemed like the only logical step, but the risk was staggering. What if she was right? What if we unleashed something far worse than whispers and shadows? Even now, as I sit here recounting everything, I can feel the weight of that house pressing down on me. I've avoided going back. Who in their right mind would? But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's truly over. The dreams haven't stopped. Neither have the whispers. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can see the tall figure standing in the corner of the room, watching me, waiting.